covering the latest updates on the appropriations tax that was just released by THUD. Now, THUD, just so you know, understand, is the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development and related agencies, and they're the ones that are going to come up with the spending for HUD, which will cover project-based rentals and also Section 8 vouchers. Now, this is why you got to pay attention to this, right? Let's kind of start talking about why this matters. And I found a pretty good infographic in here. Let me talk to you about this, right? This is why I think Section 8 rents, well, this bill is going to talk about the process, but then I want to talk briefly about why I believe rent increases are going to be a lot harder for Section 8 vouchers. Interesting, right? This is a good summary right here by NAHRO, right? You could see that the voucher renewal funding for housing assistance payments, which is the same thing as Section 8 vouchers or Housing Choice Vouchers, it's $32 billion for voucher renewal. This is the same funding as the year before. So that means it's going to be really hard for you to get rent increases for the next year, right? So let's start with the very basics, right? So this bill right here, if you guys just look up the text for it, this is the actual text. I think it starts around like page 60. You get to the THUD page. Let's see, 60 something. Where was it? Whoops. Maybe I need to search. There you go. That's when it starts. So you guys can go through the text, but every single year, essentially, Congress decides how much money to give to different departments, right? And one of those departments is going to include HUD, which is the Housing and Urban Development. That's called the appropriations process. And it's how we get funding for programs like Section 8 vouchers, project-based rental assistance, which is your project-based vouchers. I grew up on a project-based voucher, so I understand what that means. And it's also going to cover the home program. But this actual bill, right? If you remember what we talked about the other day, right? President Trump had a request through his budget to tell Congress what they would like. But even though he proposed drastic cuts to HUD, this bill right here, it kind of ignored those cuts, right? At least when it comes to Section 8 and project-based rental vouchers. So this is a question that I was thinking in my head myself, right? So can't the reconciliation process still cut HUD financing or Section 8 vouchers? Now, the answer is no, right? It can't, not directly. The reconciliation bill, which is what you hear in the news, like, hey, this was passed by like a narrow majority. They usually can cover like mandatory spending, like Medicare, Medicaid, and federal revenues, the taxes specifically, and the debt ceiling. They really can't be used to cut discretionary spending, like HUD programs like Section 8 vouchers. This is why most people right now are thinking Section 8 program will not be cut because you need 60 votes in the appropriations bill. Right. I try to think about like, how do I think about this in analogies, right? And I want to say if I had to explain this to a 10-year-old, right? Appropriations is kind of like when you go to the school lunch cafeteria and you are looking at, hey, this is what's available. This is what's the food that's on a menu today, right? That's appropriation. They tell you what you're getting. Reconciliation is sort of like you're telling someone, hey, you have $5 to spend, so you figure it out. So yes, the reconciliation bill can cap the total spending, but it can't name names, for lack of better words, right? So if you want to cut Section 8, it has to be through appropriations. And the 12 committees, this one specifically, THUD, Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development, they're responsible for cutting Section 8 if they had to listen to what Trump was ordering them around. But the good news here is that this bill didn't do it. But that obviously doesn't mean we're in clear. There's going to be a back and forth process between the House and the Senate. So let's kind of break down sort of the numbers here. And you can read through the text. You can probably just download the text and put it in ChatGPT and have it summarized for you. Honestly, that's probably a pretty good way to think about it. But there's going to be a couple more steps, right? So July 13th, that's when this bill came out. July 14th, which was 2 days ago, they did a markup, which is what I found right here. That's the markup. And then they'll probably do a full markup tomorrow. So pay attention to what happens. Okay. Pay attention to what happens. Now, I like this number because then you can see about 32 billions for voucher renewals. So you can see mostly that it's the same funding, right? They might have the overall budget, I think when I read about it, they were down slightly from fiscal year 2025, right? But the funding is flat. So that's why I think you're going to be in a position where if you're underwriting Section 8 single family homes, you're going to be thinking about how do I stop myself from overly aggressive rental assumptions, from rent increases, right? If the funding is flat for renewals, chances are it's going to be very tough to get rent increases. So if you're expecting like 3, 5, 10, 15% rent growth like you've been getting, I would err on the side of being conservative and not accounting for it. Okay. Then they had project-based rental assistance, and these are project-based vouchers, right? Just so everybody understands the difference between Section 8 vouchers and project-based vouchers. Section 8 vouchers goes with the tenant. So when that tenant moves from one home to the other, that subsidy follows them so that they never spend more than 30 to 40% of their income on rent. Project-based vouchers stays with the unit. So when you move out of your unit, and let's say you got a job, you got educated, you have a better life now, you move out of that unit, someone else can move into that unit and enjoy the same subsidy from that rental unit. That's what it means by stays that rental unit. This was huge because now it gives some more certainty, especially if you're a low income housing tax credit investor or developer. Now that you know that the rental assistance for those types of units, they're staying, so they will cover all the renewals for all those contracts. So especially if you are in like a tax exempt bond deal or you were in a RAD deal where you're converting public housing to Section 8, much better news. Now, the home funding, this is the problem for, especially if you're in like the 9% low income housing tax credit deals. Usually home funds is sort of the last dollar in, right? And this was because they justified this as there's still 5 billion sitting unused from the American Rescue Plan, so they're not going to spend it. But that loss, I mean, that could really kill some of your projects, especially if you're relying on like local soft money subsidies. So, bottom line, here's what it means. If you read through this bill and you see what the numbers and you compare it from prior year numbers, right? I think the Section 8 vouchers, they're safe. Doesn't seem like there was any cuts. That doesn't mean, again, they can't go to the appropriations committee and they go back and forth with the Senate and then they put in more cuts, right? It's not 100% safe. But I would probably expect either flat rents or more resistance to rent growth, right? So you're going to have to be on top of your public housing authority and just figure out what their next fiscal year payment standards are. And honestly, if they don't get this funding from HUD, they could get it from the state, right? So just pay very close attention to that. If you're a multifamily investor, keeping project-based rental assistance, the project-based vouchers, that's great news, but some of your gap financing could disappear, especially with losing home. Now, I think you can probably see that some of the HUD staffing was also cut. I think I read it was like 26% in another article. So I'm just trying to consolidate all these articles for all of you. So, hey, you might get slower approvals, right? They're also cutting some administrative funding for HUD, so that could affect staffing at your public housing authorities, right? So just be very, very mindful of that. If you're a ground developer, I mean, if they have flat voucher funding for project-based vouchers and Section 8 vouchers, I mean, that could either mean no new HAP contracts, which is your housing assistance payment contracts, which kind of oversees or is a contract that dictates how much rental assistance you're getting. So those delayed project-based voucher awards, that could be a little dicey. Just be very mindful. All right. So let's talk about what's next. So here's what could happen next, right? The Senate, right? The Senate could write its own bill, and because you need 60 votes, that could be friendlier to the home program or the housing programs, right? Because then you need probably, I think it was like at least 7 Democrats who vote alongside Republicans. They could try to reconcile the difference, right? Especially with what they're expecting or what the White House is pushing, because they might be face pressure to stay under the total spending targets, right? Or maybe they can't agree and then you get a continuing resolution, right? So you hear about continuing resolution a lot. So that's kind of like a thing where they're just kicking the can down a road. So that's something that you want to be really mindful of. And if they do a continuing resolution, then the funding level is going to be the same as the prior year, but it still could cause some uncertainty. It could delay any lease ups, especially if you're a multifamily investor. It could probably still block any new home awards, even though the latest version in the appropriation text has cut home funding. So this wasn't all doom and gloom. If you were on my live a couple of days ago, we probably saw that the White House budget had much more aggressive cuts towards HUD, especially when they had like 2-year working requirements, et cetera, for them not to come on the budget. But this is where the rubber meets the road. The Appropriations Committee has to meet some of the top line. All the Appropriations Committee has to meet the top line budget that might be pushed down to them. So I'm glad the Section 8 are still funded in this text. Doesn't mean it can't get cut later, but at the very minimum, we know that the funding is flat. So that's your quote unquote best case scenario. Section 8 is not cut, but there are no rent increases. This is sort of the best case scenario. So I would argue it likely would just probably go down from here. But the home funding was cut. So if you rely on home fund, and just so you know, you guys can always check out the if you guys want to look up, right? If you guys ask ChatGPT, what's the best podcast on affordable housing investments, you see our podcast. And there are some podcast episodes specifically about the home fund. I think I did one with Tim Van Roy. So you guys can see what's going on here. All right. So I hope this was helpful, everybody. Please ask some questions. I hope you subscribe to our YouTube channel. And I'm going to try to stay on top of what's happening with the subtext, with the back and forth, especially as we think about how it can affect Section 8 real estate investing, and all things affordable housing investments. All right. I appreciate you all. And thank you for tuning in to today's live, day 656. I'll see you back tomorrow for day 657. Have a good one, everybody.